and welcome to this episode of Ask CPS. Today we'll be discussing the Health Inspectorate here on St Martin. We're joined by Dr. Earl Best, and he will also be talking a little bit about the UK variant. So welcome to the show, Earl.
Hi Lee, thank you for inviting me over.
Sure, no problem. Really good of you to join us. So let's get straight into it. I know that you are the inspector for the Health Inspectorate, you're head of that organisation. Can you give us a little bit of information about the Health Inspectorate, their roles and responsibilities, and particularly where you fall in underneath that?
Well, okay, sure. The Health Inspectorate is primarily an enforcement agency. That means that we enforce several laws in the field of healthcare, pharmaceuticals, food safety, labor, and daycare centers right now. Besides that, we also have a strong advisory role towards the minister and other departments like CPS or the Department of Public Health, and outside of the ministry as well to other ministries.
Okay, so particularly in terms of your advisory role, are you often requested to advise on various outbreaks? How deeply have you been involved with COVID-19?
Yes, sure. Well, actually, I was the first one who started with the whole campaign in February 2020. When the EOC was not activated yet and CPS was not really worried about COVID. I remember that time I started with giving some sessions, courses. I even did a training with the Coast Guard at that time and some radio sessions together with the then Minister Pamela Gordon. On the whole outbreak, it was still a far from home situation, but we were already sure it was coming our way, it was heading our way. So at that time, we started with all those sessions. DCOM will also remember, we did a couple of sessions primarily for DCOM, getting them familiar with the whole COVID, the virus, etc. And in March, actually, CPS picked up and the EOC was activated. Everybody remembers that. We went in a lockdown around 22 of March. For about, what was the lockdown, 4 or 5 weeks. And before that, we already had cases. That was one. And secondly, there was no lab ready yet. But we had cruise ships coming in still. Everybody will remember the case with the Braemar. That was the cruise ship that was sailing between St. Martin and Santo Domingo. And remained on sea until we decided to let them come in and exchange the crew here. That was where I was directly involved in the decision making around that time. Afterwards, I went a bit in the background, but still very actively involved in assisting, providing support, advising CPS, the minister, etc.
So if we talk a little bit more about the initial stages, presumably you were considering border controls and then they were implemented. I mean, how was that process and what sparked that sense of urgency?
Okay, actually after the first wave, we had to come out of lockdown. And I'm talking about June, July 2020, May, June, July. And in that period, we also realized what the effect had been of the first wave and the lockdown on the economy of St. Martin. So one of the objectives was to open up the country as soon as possible back in a safe way, in a safe public health way, and lowering the risk of import of COVID as much as possible for the island. And that's where I came in again, not as inspector, but more as a developer of the now quite established EHA System, which I was the founder of together with some programmers. And that system has been set in place since the first week of August. And because of that system, we could actually open up our borders in a responsible way. The system has meanwhile been perfected along the way, changes were made, but also the situation in the world changed and regionally changed quite a lot. So it's a continuous process of adjustments to the system, depending on the risk the country status, the spread of the virus, etc. So I'm still deeply involved with EHAS as one of the admins and helping out wherever I can.
And what would you say are the major benefits of EHAS? How does it help you maintain safe entry and exit to and from St. Martin?
Okay, for those who don't know the EHA system, it stands for the Electronic Health Authorization System, which every visitor, being a resident or tourist, who enter the island needs to fill out. They need to apply through the system, whereby your personal data, your travel history, and also your health situation, your health status is being actually asked during the application. Besides that, if you're coming from what we consider a high-risk country, you have to upload as well a PCR test or antigen test, depending where you're coming from. So the final application, once it's complete, will be reviewed and access will be granted to enter St. Martin or denied, either one of the two. And the EHA system and also the final decision based on the EHA system is anchored in the law. You need to have it backed by a law. That's a public health law in this case, which allows the Minister of VSA basically to take measures to protect the country. So one of those measures was actually putting the EHA system in place to protect our border. Originally, EHA was also developed to deal with sea travel. That was later transferred to another system based in the port. So we're doing mainly people coming in by airplane and remaining here or transiting, or people who come in by airplane and continue on a maritime vessel.
So I know that having obviously entered St. Martin a couple of times myself, that I've had to have a PCR test, and indeed whenever I try to go home, I also need a PCR test. So how did these conversations develop? How did you decide on which populations we should be screening, whether it's PCR, whether it's antigen? How did we get to where we are now?
Well, it's quite complicated. Let me put it this way, because you cannot be too discriminatory in the system. That's one. We know that we depend from the United States for a great part with regard to tourism. So the US market and the Canadian market has been treated a bit different in the system compared to the EU market and the regional market. For example, as you know, in the EHA system, the US and Canada, they can also upload antigen tests, which does not apply for any of the other countries. Okay, so there is a bit of a difference. Also, the PCR, instead of the 72 hours for the US, is still allowed to do it in 5 days before departing to St. Martin. So those differences have actually increased the tourism to St. Martin again. We are about 30-40% now of what it used to be, which is still quite considerable comparing it to other islands in the region. And we have managed to keep the numbers in COVID pretty low, even with the increase in tourism. So I must say the EHA system does do a good job. It performs well. And the last thing that we added was in January, we added the mandatory COVID insurance for everybody coming to the island who is not a resident, a French national, or from one of the neighboring islands in the kingdom, say West Asia. So that mandatory COVID insurance was added to cover the expenses that are related to someone who develops a disease during the stay here. Normal insurances didn't cover the COVID-related costs. So it's for quite cheap, $30 for 180 days. So most people take it without any objection.
Yeah,
so these are all, yes.
It sounds like quite good value for money.
Yes, sure, it is. And we haven't gotten any complaints, and it works. And I must say we have managed to keep the numbers pretty low so far. Of course, also with all the other measures like wearing the mouth mask, hand washing, strict quarantining if you're sick, social distancing, you name it. So we have gotten used to it, to those measures, and thank God we're able to keep the numbers low. We're seeing some increases now, and we'll get into that in a few seconds.
Yeah, that's probably a fair introduction. But before we go on to that, I'd like to just briefly touch on where you see border restrictions heading in the future, especially with the advent of the vaccine.
In general, the vaccine right now does not prevent individuals from contracting or getting infected with COVID. That's one. So you will need to keep some border control in place. And people will still need to get tested before they come if you want to do it in a proper manner. And that will remain at least the case for the next year, if you ask me, because countries will need to reach herd immunity status before you can really say we open up the border, we consider them low risk. And that will not be the case so soon, given the scarcity of vaccines right now. So I think we will be in this situation for another year at least, but traveling will become easier. Cross-border traveling will become easier due to the vaccination campaign that's being rolled out in many countries now. So yes, we will have to be still on guard with regard to our border.
Yeah, I noticed that maybe last week or the week before that the EU have just announced the release of, what are they called now, the green digital certificates. These are essentially vaccine passports, right?
Yes, these are EU approved kind of passports. They're not travel passports, and they have made sure that the measure is not discriminatory, because you have always people who will not, or we will be reluctant to vaccinate. That's one. And you will have people who said, yeah, I have had COVID, so why do I need to vaccinate? So these people you cannot discriminate. So the EU passport that they intend to bring out, the EU started indeed with it, will have different types of information on it. Your vaccination status. It will also cover whether you had a PCR test or not and what the result was. And it will cover whether you had COVID in the past, meaning that you might have developed some antibodies already. So it's not only the vaccination status that will play a role.
Okay, perfect. Let's go for a short break. So stay tuned and we'll be back shortly. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Hi. So in the last video, we explained what is a vaccine and how it works. But do you know how it's developed? Every vaccine is developed following the same steps and stages. Pharmaceutical stage. When the genetic code for the virus becomes available, scientists can start to develop a vaccine. Preclinical stage. In this stage, the vaccine is tested in a lab on human tissue, and if that works, on animals to see if the response is the same. Clinical stage. Phase 1. The vaccine is given to a handful of volunteers. In Phase 2, it's given to hundreds of volunteers in different doses. In the last phase, the best performing dose will be given to thousands of volunteers. License stage. This stage looks at the previous results to determine if it is safe for the general population. Serious side effects are not accepted and steps cannot be skipped. The requirements for a vaccine to be approved are very strict and the same for all vaccines. When approved, a vaccine is therefore considered just as safe as all other vaccines. If approved, the vaccine can be produced and distributed. However, the safety is always monitored, even when the vaccine is already on the market.
Welcome back to Ask CPS. My name is Dr. Bowman, epidemiologist based at CPS, and we are talking today to Dr. Best of the Health Inspectorate. So welcome back to the programme.
Yes, Lee.
In the previous session, we were talking mostly about generally the role of Health Inspectorate, in particular with regard to the initial stages of COVID-19, and then we touched upon the travel restrictions and how some of those policy decisions were made. I think what would be a nice segue now is to move into COVID-19 and the additional variants. So I think it's in the popular discourse, there's clearly a number of variants out there: South African strain, Brazilian strain, the UK strain. I think to go back to basics, how do these mutants, how do these variants appear?
Okay, well, we're talking about viruses, and viruses like humans even, and other bacteria, we all look for survival. And one way to survive is to mutate. And mutation means that the species actually changes their DNA and RNA sequence, and that will be reflected in what we call the phenotype, meaning the exterior appearance of the virus. And mutations usually happen in nature due to, one, is its survival, and second, it might also be caused by, for example, radio waves or a radiation. Okay, those things might cause mutation as well in species, whether it's animals, humans, viruses, you name it. So the viruses, the variants, they mutate, and where they are discovered first of causing a big outbreak or clusters, that's where they get their name from. So the UK virus variant was, for example, seen first in the UK, where it had various clusters and outbreaks, hence the name the UK variant, or B117 as it's scientifically called. The South African is the same, that's the B1351 variant, and the Brazilian B1 variant. They were all linked to outbreaks in the respective countries where they were first detected and seen, and causing a spread of the virus, which was more, let's call it, virulent than the SARS-CoV-2 as we know it from the beginning.
Now, I know there are additional variants, the Californian strain and some others. So I think that the variants seem to be categorized into variants of interest and variants of concern. So could you describe a little bit more about that?
Yes, so these variants indeed are classified into variants of interest, variants of concern, and variants of high consequence. And the categorization is basically based on a couple of criteria, which one of them is, of course, the spreading of the virus, the rate of spreading. The second one is the prevalence of the virus, meaning how prevalent, how much cases do you have in your community. The risk of reinfection, the severity of the disease it causes, and if there is, for example, also interference with test diagnostic possibilities. Some of these variants cannot be detected easily by the current diagnostics we have. And if there is resistance to existing therapies, like dexamethasone and other antivirus, and also whether vaccines are able to provide protection against those variants. So based on those criteria, we would classify something as a new variant as a variant of interest, meaning it's not actually a danger, it's not spreading rapidly, the prevalence is very low, etc., to one of high consequence. That's a variant where we really see explosive, like what is happening now in Curacao, an explosiveness in the prevalence of people with disease, developing disease. It spread very rapidly, very quickly, and luckily for us, the tests are still able to detect the virus in these cases. Okay, we don't know yet whether all these vaccines work very well against the variants. It seems that they are doing the job, but more studies are needed to make sure that the current vaccines are also protecting against these variants. We know that, for example, the UK variant, apparently the Pfizer vaccine that we're getting now in St. Martin, actually protects against the UK variant. The South African variant, less. We have not found the South African variant here yet, but the UK variant is for sure is already present on the island.
Yeah, so I know that on the French side, they detected roughly 24 cases of the UK variant. And although we haven't detected it this side, I have to stress that it's a random sample. So it's not necessarily likely that we're going to pick it up unless it's really rampant through the population. So the fact that it is here is of concern. And the fact that Aruba, Bonaire and Curacao are all experiencing quite severe outbreaks is also of concern. So that brings us nicely back to our travel conversation and whether or not you think that border restrictions might change in the foreseeable future because of these outbreaks on neighboring islands.
Yeah, sure. We have a lot of travel, of course, with the States. The variants are not really, let's say, a matter of high concern right now from the States, but what we are seeing now in the ABC Islands, that is really a matter of concern. And if you look at what we call the positivity rate, that means the amount of positive cases amongst all the tests that you do in a day, then we can see, for example, that the positivity rate in Curacao is about 20 to 25% on average. In Bonaire, it's today, for example, in Bonaire, it was 42%. And in Aruba today, it's 28%. So it's spreading very rapidly. That is what you can conclude from this. That's one. And second, what is more a cause for concern is the impact it has on the healthcare in the country, on the healthcare, the hospitals, etc. So if you look at how many people right now, for example, in Curacao are active, that's 1,642, and 50 have been admitted in the hospital, of which 14 on the ICU. That's a lot. And it means that the hospital has to do everything possible to keep up with what is coming in. So it will really place a burden on your regular healthcare as well. You will have to downscale your regular healthcare in order to cope with the COVID situation. And that is what is happening now in Bonaire, in Curacao, and in Aruba. Aruba has 46 currently hospitalized, of which 12 on the IC. Bonaire has 16 hospitalized, 1 in Curacao, 1 in Aruba on the IC, and 5 on the IC in Bonaire. So Bonaire is actually already full, the IC. Okay. So this means that the current situation in Aruba, Bonaire, Curacao might as well happen in St. Martin. And before you know it, we are having now on a weekly basis 5 flights, 2 from Bonaire and 3 from Jeddah between Curacao and St. Martin. And some of them start in Bonaire, some start in Aruba of the flight. So it's just a matter of time before we get it here. And what we need to do is really protect our borders. That means we have to seriously think about doing something with these flights coming in now, whether it's going to be a travel ban or we add those islands to the travel ban country list and make sure that we do not import it from these islands right now. On another note, as I said earlier, we have to sync all our policies with the French side. That means that if the French side has open traffic also with Guadeloupe and Martinique, where we have more UK variants, they will also have to implement a travel ban for those or between those islands. And that's what I meant with syncing policies when I just mentioned that. So we have to do something because we will get the same problem here as Curacao, Bonaire, and Aruba are experiencing currently. Lack of staff, lack of resources. You might have beds, but still no staff, etc. And it means that people are going to die.
I think maybe some people might argue that we've had, a fair few cases here on the island. So maybe we have some kind of natural immunity to these additional variants, or is that not quite how it works?
Well, To tell you the truth, if I look at the French side, I've been recently on the French side, and if I see how people move around there, the whole mouth mask wearing is much serious on the Dutch side than on the French side. You can go anywhere on the French and nobody wearing a mask. And that's okay. I must say both sides, we do a lot in the open, outside, that's our lock. We have a high temperature, environmental ambient temperature here of about 28 to 32 on a daily basis. We have wind. So these factors indeed contribute a bit to keeping things low. But the most riskful situation is where you have gathering of people together and without social distancing. And surely if it's in a closed environment, in a building, that's where you get a higher risk of contracting the disease. And maybe it's because we do a lot outside that we do not see these figures soaring really up. But if you get a variant here that's much more contagious, spreads more rapidly, like the UK variant, then we sure as hell going to get an explosion here. And it means that our hospital, which has about 14 ICU beds with the auxiliary center included, that we will have faced the same problems as Curaçao is facing now.
Yeah, and certainly from my perspective, I know that the UK variant that first emerged at the back end of 2020 did so during lockdown. You know, there was significant social restrictions that were happening there, and still the variant was easily transmitted. So I think the major concern from us, from our perspective, is that yes, we might have a couple of cases here on the island of the UK variant, but when we start to see multiple seeds, then we could end up rather quickly, actually, in a scenario that's not dissimilar to Aruba, Bonaire, or Curaçao.
Correct. And the way forward is get vaccinated. Everybody should really get vaccinated. Register online or register at the vaccination places, Bel Air, CPS, and get your vaccines as soon as possible. And maintain the social distancing, wear your mask, quarantine if you don't feel well, don't go to work, etc. Okay, those measures still need to remain in place at all times. And
Yeah, and I can second that. Certainly, if you are feeling any symptoms, please come forward, come get tested at Point Blanche. It's open every morning. It's free testing, so please drop by, get tested, and let's try to maintain this status quo with a low number of cases until we get our vaccination coverage up there, so that we can start to see a return to normal.
Correct.
That is it from Ask CPS for another episode. So I'd like to thank very warmly Dr. Earl Best for joining us from Health Inspectorate.
Thank you, Lee, and listeners, thank you all, and be safe.